This is almost the midpoint of the term, and we had a big festival, so from now on, it's not dark here, but a little bit cooler. So we have a couple of good lectures. So the next 2 weeks, we still have the Chinese movies Tuesday night, so please go on and see it. I know it's been very successful. And then we have a couple of lectures coming up, all very exciting, so please check our schedule. And especially I can tell you that next month, November, we have informal exhibition of Chinese photographs down in the lobby of this building. So please come. It'll be a whole month, so you'll see some magnificent views of Chinese scenery painting, and so it's beautiful there. And then at the end of kind of 21st, I think, no, I don't remember the date, but the last Friday, the third Friday of November, we have a very important lecture on Chinese painting and material arts given by one of the top scholars on Chinese painting. So make sure you come to that too. And we have a lecture on picking opera, costumes, and architecture. So it's very, very diverse. So make sure to come. You will enjoy those talks. Now today's lecture is a very fascinating one, and also is very timely, because as you know now, China is kind of transforming and beginning a lot of talks about how to tighten up the ideology and things. So I think Dr. Kusnetzky's talk is really right on, because really some new lessons in class and class struggle in China are happening. So now this is, first let me say a few words about Dr. Kusnetzky. She is an anthropologist, a degree from CUNY in New York, 2011. She lives in Ann Arbor, so we have access to her wisdom and expertise. And I must say that this talk, like all good things that takes time, has been in the process for 2 years. I have asked Lara to come to do this talk 2 years ago, but because of different things, it did not happen until today. So I think Chinese says good things take time, but good shows come last. So good show today, Lara.
Is the volume all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Joseph, for the kind words and the invitation, and also to you and me and St. Becker for all of their help in organizing this event. During the 1970s, the exhibition on the history of class struggle in the Gejiu Tin Mines and the Recollect Bitterness Center in Gejiu City were the premier classrooms for class education in all of Yunnan province. From 1972 to 1974, 1,000 visitors a day came to this tin mining region in southern Yunnan to view these two exhibitions. When the exhibitions were dismantled in 1979, they had instructed over 1 million visitors in the essential lessons of class education. 千万不要忘记阶级斗争. Never forget class struggle. The exhibition on the history of class struggle in the Gejiu Tin Mines opened to the public in March of 1972. It was comprised of 2 large galleries that displayed pre-liberation artifacts, drawings of historical events, a set of life-size clay sculptures, and personal accounts of capitalist exploitation. After visiting this exhibition, visitors were taken by bus to the Recollect Bitterness Center, a theme park located at the site of an old tin mine. Its central attraction was the Recollect Bitterness Pit, a mining tunnel 400 meters long. Visitors crawled through this winding, dark tunnel in order to experience for themselves the working conditions of the old society, 旧社会. These 2 prominent exhibitions were created by cultural workers at the order of the Yunnan Province Revolutionary Committee to conduct political education. This education demonstrated and explained the Marxian concepts of class and class struggle by providing visitors with a 有血有肉, a flesh and blood experience of the social existence of classes and a class struggle in the old society, as told from the standpoint of the working class. I argue that exhibitions such as these two in Gejiu were a crucial site of 体会, of learning through experience, and that the exhibitions used historical reenactment as a pedagogical method to impart an embodied knowledge of the Chinese past. Through historical reenactments performed for visitors and by visitors, the visitors learned through experience the exploitation, revolt, and liberation of the Chinese proletariat. This instillment of 感性认识, perceptual knowledge about the nature of classes and the meaning of proletarian revolution, produced an embodied understanding of Chinese Marxist history. It interpolated proper political subjects, and it incited socialist construction. My talk today is part of a broad reflection on the pedagogical project of the party state. In particular, I am concerned with the ways in which communist ideological discourse affords a meaningful framework for perceiving and producing history, society, and the self, and with the ways in which the propagation of this framework creates a specific historical dynamic between ideology and subject formation. Ideology matters, in other words, at an intimate personal level. The Chinese Communist practice of ideological work, 政治思想工作, does not operate on an autonomous self with an objective existence, but specific historical selves come into being in dialogue with language, subject positions, and narratives provided by the Communist Party, whether in the socialist past or in the supposedly post-socialist present. The cultural works of the Mao era, class education exhibitions, woodblock prints, model operas, and so forth, are works of propaganda, imbued with the political messages and revolutionary motivations of their time. These cultural works have long been denigrated in the West as political expressions of a false ideology that are neither true art nor authentic historical accounts. The function of these cultural works, however, was to provide political education, instructing Chinese citizens in the conceptual vocabulary and historical truth claims of Chinese Marxist ideology. Cultural works inserted viewers into the party's imagination of power, history, and identity, and assisted in the production of particular historical selves by linking self-knowledge to socio-historical truth. Propaganda, in other words, actively crafted socialist subjects in relation to a truth regime. In the communist worldview, proper personhood is a material expression of correct ideology. And correct ideology is the precondition for revolutionary agency and for any proper functioning in socialist society. This afternoon, I shall analyze the two class education exhibitions held in Gejiu during the 1970s in order to show that class education exhibitions worked to interpolate political subjects through performance and through affect. These exhibitions demonstrate two additional points. First, propaganda is more specific than is generally allowed. Cultural workers created propaganda that was local in its physical details, but universal in its implication. Because the universal lessons of propaganda changed with shifts in Chinese Marxist theorization, local detail was put to changing uses, sometimes leading to contradictions over time. Second, cultural workers created propaganda to link individuals to broader national narratives of struggle, progress, legitimacy, and belonging. These linkages were crucial to the inscription of ideology onto subjectivity, and hence to the struggles over political representation and historical authorship, whether during the Mao era or the Reform era. I will conclude my talk today by revisiting these arguments with an anecdote from my fieldwork in Gejiu. The use of local exhibitions for political education was not new in the 1970s, nor was it unique to Yunnan province. During the 1950s and 1960s, local exhibitions were held in communities all over the PRC. They were part of the larger effort to rewrite local experience and the local landscape in the universal language of Chinese Marxism and in the artistic style of socialist realism. Local exhibitions were just one concrete form of cultural work that used local detail, local speech, local habits, local industry, to show that local lives and local experiences conform to the scientific truths of Marxism, and that they fit the universal history of the Chinese nation. In Gejiu, Chinese Marxist history was given concrete expression in the figure of the shading or sandhog, a derogatory local term for a tin miner. In communist propaganda, the word shading acquired historical and ideological force by coming to life as a downtrodden beast of burden who toiled on his knees in the dark mines of the old society, underfed and whipped by capitalist tin bosses. Under the leadership of underground members of the Communist Party, the shading rose up in arms during the 1940s. At the moment of national liberation, shading transformed into gongren, or workers, and became masters of the new society, 新社会. In other words, cultural workers in Gejiu identified local history with the extraction of tin, and therefore used the biography and autobiography of the shading to explain Marxist concepts and to prove the universality of the Marxist history of the Chinese nation. During the 1950s, cultural workers in Gejiu created didactic exhibitions that emphasized the contrast between the life of the shading before liberation and of the gongren after liberation. For example, a drawing of a dilapidated thatched huofang, a local term for the huts where the tin bosses housed shading, was juxtaposed to a photograph of the sturdy brick dormitories recently built for socialist workers. In such juxtapositions, the moment of liberation, 解放, marks a rupture, a new and absolute historical divide in the narrated time of the nation, a rupture that separates the shading from the gongren, slavery from mastery, despair from hope, darkness from light. The shading and the gongren, in other words, make the divide between the past and the present visible and intelligible. They demonstrate, in local terms, the universal historical progress of the Chinese nation under socialism. This propaganda technique of juxtaposing before liberation and after liberation is called 经济对比, to contrast the past with the present. The temporal stills of before and after offer stark emblems of discrepant times, emblems that give concrete expression to a prescriptive vision of history and historical progress, and that thereby legitimize party rule. The socialist education movement of the early 1960s called for the creation of local exhibitions that would instruct visitors about the nature of classes and class struggle in order to combat the forces of bourgeois revisionism. The narratives of these exhibitions, in other words, substantiated Mao Zedong's theory of continuous revolution formulated in 1962. This theory posited that classes and class struggle continued to exist in socialist society. A continuous revolution, therefore, had to be waged in the ideological field to secure the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under these conditions, political instruction had to instill perceptual knowledge of classes and of class struggle, and had to mobilize all citizens to eradicate bourgeois ideology and feudal dispositions. In the first 10 points of May 20th, 1963, Mao had argued that perceptual knowledge, that is, knowledge derived through sensory experience, was the prerequisite for the derivation of objective truth. It was the basis of the dialectical relationship between Marxist theory and revolutionary practice. The acquisition of perceptual knowledge was especially imperative for youth who lacked direct experience of class struggle, but were now recruited to, quote, carry the revolution through to the end, end quote. Class education exhibitions of the socialist education movement introduced historical reenactment as the means to learn from experience, the means for the citizenry to assimilate vicariously the historical experience of the Chinese proletariat through sensory experience. This historical reenactment primarily took the form of yiku, both in written form and in live performances. Yiku meaning to recollect bitterness. To recollect bitterness is to provide a retrospective personal account of exploitation, revolt, and liberation. The narrative practice of yiku is a reenactment of the older powerful practice of suku, venting grievances, a method of class struggle during land reform. The old workers and old peasants who recollected bitterness at these class education exhibitions therefore reenacted class struggle, the public exposure and indictment of a class enemy. In contrast to land reform, however, these model orators did not condemn present injustices, or suku, but rather recalled hardship before 1949. Moreover, as they spoke about their experience of class exploitation and class oppression in the old society, they performed and demonstrated working class subjectivity. At the same time, the old workers and old peasants allowed a younger generation to experience the visceral emotions and bodily gestures of class struggle. Pre-liberation artifacts, props such as tattered garments or physical scars, amplified the compelling narratives of these ikuren, recollectors of bitterness. They provided, quote, bloody evidence of the grim truth of their stories and of their revolutionary agency. Finally, the practice of yiku was intended to raise the class consciousness of listeners by inspiring a Gejiu, a class sentiment. By speaking as classed subjects and as metonymic representations, old workers and old peasants narrated Chinese Marxist history as autobiography and as the biography of their class. Along with their various props, they worked to convert individual lived experience into collective historical memory and into a political incitement to remember. By investing bodies, objects, and memory with proletarian ideology, these model instructors, these ikuren, worked to interpolate the desired political subjects of continuous revolution in order to realize its radical ambitions. Like the class education exhibitions of the socialist education movement, the class education exhibitions of the Cultural Revolution sought to impart knowledge through the senses, but they extended sensory perception from sight and hearing to include touch, taste, and smell. And the exhibitions of the 1970s, of course, reflected the political priorities and ideological reorientation of the Chinese Communist Party in its retreat from the radical phase of the Cultural Revolution. As a result, the exhibition on the history of class struggle in the Gejiu Tin Mines and the Recollect Bitterness Center were devised to incite socialist construction rather than socialist revolution. They promoted political order, the recovery of the economy, and the retreat from Mao's theory of continuous revolution. The exhibition on the history of class struggle in the Gejiu Tin Mines was comprised of 2 exhibition galleries in which the Shading made visible the history of the Chinese nation through local suffering, local armed struggle, and local emancipation. The first exhibition gallery was comprised of 14 tableaus that showed the local truth of Chinese Marxist history by means of drawings, pre-liberation artifacts, written renditions of Recollect Bitterness narratives, and apt quotations by Mao Zedong and Lenin. The second exhibition gallery displayed a single sculptural tableau of 95 life-size human figures and 1 dog, molded out of clay. This tableau gave form to a Recollect Bitterness narrative in 5 parts, namely, cajoled into becoming miners, senseless suffering, inhuman treatment, revolt, and ushering in liberation. Docents conducted visitors on tours of these 2 galleries. The tours sometimes included live performances of yiku. As docents led visitors through the first gallery, they recounted a memorized script that quoted liberally from so-called 学雷史, histories of blood and tears of old miners. In combination with the historical artifacts in the display cases, the recited script conjured images of laboring bodies. The words, objects, and images together produced a powerful sense of palpable truth. For example, docents would point to a pickaxe and 2 iron shackles that had been unearthed from a mining district and would explain that old miner Zhang had been forced to seek work in the mines in order to repay the mounting debt he owed to landlord Huang. With his pickaxe, old miner Zhang toiled for long hours in the cold, dark tunnels for a pitiful wage. To prevent him from escaping, Tin Boss Zhu put shackles on his ankles. To identify miners as members of a class, docents explained their living conditions in the old society. They pointed, for example, to glass cases that exhibited the dirty, tattered rags and the hemp bags that Shading had worn, and to the wild greens that Shading had gathered and eaten. To prove the inhumanity of the capitalist class, these belongings of the Shading were juxtaposed with evidence of the wealth and privilege that tin bosses acquired through their exploitation of the working class, such as the luxurious silk garments that tin bosses had worn and the rare delicacies that tin bosses had eaten, such as turtle or fatty beef. The relational nature of antithetical classes was illustrated also by drawings of Huofang, where Shading lived, hung next to an elegantly furnished period room taken from the mansion of a tin boss. Recollect Bitterness narratives with graphic scenes of abuse and torture, moreover demonstrated the, quote, fascist reactionary rule of the capitalist class, proved also by exhibits of the leather whips that henchmen had used on Shading and the excavated bones of Shading who had been worked to death. Near the end of the first gallery, docents pointed to worn editions of the propaganda songs that the underground communist organizer Li Xin had written in the late 1920s to mobilize Gejiu miners. And docents drew attention to drawings of miners' uprisings in the late 1940s. And finally, they recounted stories about old miners who had, quote, jumped out of the bitter waters in 1949 at the moment of liberation. The Recollect Bitterness narrative of old miner Dai Bingyuan, for example, ended with the following words, quote, the party and Chairman Mao are our parents. We miners have been reborn from them. We will always follow Chairman Mao's teachings. We will always act according to his instructions, and we will carry the revolution through to the end, end quote. The clay figures in the second gallery again recounted Chinese Marxist history as biography, as the local lived experience of Gejiu Tin miners. At the same time, this sculptural tableau performed what I call the metaphorical and physical choreography of liberation, the movement from the bent, oppressed Shading to the upright, empowered Gongren. In other words, this recollect bitterness narrative in sculptural form both illustrated and reenacted the transformative power of proletarian revolution. The pre-liberation artifacts, the artwork, the period rooms, and the clay sculptures in the exhibition on the history of class struggle in the Gejiu Tin Mines fixed an empiricist gaze on the corporal experience of the Shading. They reduced historical complexity to socialist realist typicality, and they narrated Chinese Marxist history as historical memory. By matching historical objects with the living memories of old miners, and by matching the linear progression of the historical narrative to the visitor's movement through space, the exhibition created a record of a universal historical experience, accessible and verifiable in the local present. This undeniable embodied truth proved in turn that the existence of classes and of class struggle were 铁事实, iron facts. This material evidence of 真人真事, real people and real events, produced rational understanding based on perceptual knowledge. But the sensorial and moving experience of proletarian revolution also generated affect. By their engagement with the teaching materials, each a testimony to an actual life, visitors experienced the material reality of class existence and reenacted class struggle as an emotional progression, from tears and pain, indices of exploitation and oppression, to a compelling indignation, an index of revolt, and finally to elated joy, an index of liberation. In interviews I conducted, docents recalled that visitors were supposed to weep. If the visitors cried, the docents had been effective in setting the mood and in bringing the evidence to life. Tears were elicited especially by live performances of yiku, whether staged or given spontaneously by an old miner on the tour. For the docents, tears indicated the achievement of a new, clearer understanding of the relationship between the sweet present and the bitter past, an understanding that brought to the visitors a sense of relief and of gratitude to the party. The Recollect Bitterness Center at Song Mine extended beyond the visual and material evidence of the galleries in Gejiu to impart perceptual knowledge of classes and class struggle through the full range of the senses. The Recollect Bitterness Center was not a generic urban exhibition hall. It was an old mine in the mountains southeast of Gejiu. Here, the oppressive past asserted itself in the liberated present at 5 Recollect Bitterness sites to provide undeniable physical evidence of class antagonism and of class struggle during the brief semi-colonial and semi-feudal stage of historical development. The trek to reach the Recollect area from the small administrative town of Song Mine, where visitors disembarked, up through the rugged mountain terrain, enhanced the compelling historicity of this encounter with the bitter past, as it severed visitors from their familiar world and confronted them with the unknown. The old miners who often led tours or recollected bitterness at one of the 5 sites further intensified the social realism of the theme park. This reunion of a space of experience with its former inhabitants accentuated the authenticity of the architectural and material remains of the past and confirmed the accuracy of the historical narrative. The Recollect Bitterness Mill, where a worn millstone, old picks, an ore separation area, and a sludge bank demonstrated the primitive techniques of tin production in the old society. The Recollect Bitterness Hofan, where jars of foraged food and tattered garments of shading suggested the misery of daily life. The Recollect Bitterness Blockhouse, where a windowless jail, a torture chamber, instruments of torture, and testimonials of, quote, the criminal history of tin boss Jobortai provided evidence of the savage rule of the capitalist class. The Recollect Bitterness and the Recollect Bitterness White Bone Cave, where excavated bones of dead miners reminded visitors of the cruel fate of the working class in the old society. The centerpiece of the Recollect area, however, was the Recollect Bitterness Pit, made up of restored and remodeled pre-liberation pits. This tunnel forced visitors to assume the position of a miner in the old society, in a manner at the same time physical and metaphorical. As they experienced the oppressive, dank, dusty soil of the tunnel through all of their five senses, they also forcibly performed a Recollect Bitterness narrative and embodied in their person the time and space of official history. Visitors descended into the darkness in small groups with small oil lamps to light the way, just as miners in the old society had done. In the 16 segments of the pit, visitors had to crawl on their knees, overcome obstacles, or grasp at old indentations in the walls to gain leverage. In the 6th segment, for example, visitors had to squirm on their stomachs to get through a narrow passage. In the next 7 segments of the pit, their bodies remained bent over under intermittent hardship, impressing on them how tin bosses had exploited and oppressed the shading. At the 14th segment of the pit, called the Reservoir of Agitation, visitors began to ascend, feeling the uplift of the approaching revolution. The penultimate segment, called the Pit of the Rankled Heart, was located a few meters from the exit. Mounting the steep incline required determination, the resolution to forge a path of deliverance. As visitors neared the end, warm sunlight filled the shaft, and upon their final exit, they stood up tall at last. This physical and metaphorical reenactment of the choreography of liberation not only produced an embodied memory of Chinese Marxist history, but it also reminded visitors that the Communist Party and its revolutionary line had offered the means of emancipation. By its juxtaposition of darkness and light, of bent and erect bodies, and of pain and joy, the Recollect Bitterness Pit created a sensory experience of the contrast between the past and the present, and of the transformative power of class struggle. A truth regime was grounded in the body. The youth of Gejiu received an even more immersive version of this lesson in class education. After emerging from the pit, young visitors were served yiku fan, recollect bitterness food, the wild greens that Shading had eaten. And thereafter they were given a ride in the electric trams of the modernized socialist mines, where they stood upright in cement-enforced shafts and surveyed technological developments and improvements in labor conditions. Corporeal experiences to reassure them that theirs was a golden age. The date is 2003. I am conducting field work with retirees of the Yunnan Tin Corporation, the main employer in Gejiu. A YTC retiree He Ming is a local authority on Gejiu history. His knowledge derives from his years as a miner and as a party cadre engaged in so-called cultural work. He has summoned me on the pretense of providing me with literary artifacts of Xiwenhua, tin culture. In the late 1990s, the city government of Gejiu devised the notion of tin culture to promote tourism. It needed a new source of revenue to supplement the declining revenue from its main source of income, the tin industry. Tin culture was the hook to attract tourists to the historic scenery and folklore associated with the vanishing local mineral. The promotion of tin culture required that the city officials recast the landscape and the history of Gejiu in accordance with yet another new political narrative, the narrative of the socialist market economy, just as city officials of previous generations had repeatedly rewritten the local past in response to the political campaigns of the Mao era. To create a marketable past, city officials looked to retirees like He Ming for assistance. He Ming is very willing to help the current officials to fit the local past and the local present to the new model of culture, yet his ethnicity is a problem. The Han majority insists that the Gejiu tin industry remain an emblem of Han Chinese socialist modernity. He disagrees and instead advocates a version of the local past that emphasizes contributions of men such as he, namely miners of the Yi ethnicity. His proposals to the local officials fall on deaf ears, and so he takes matters into his own hands. In the afternoon, I arrive at the designated time and place. To my astonishment, He Ming has secured a reporter and a camera crew from a local state-owned television channel for the purpose of filming his accounts of tin culture for a foreign audience, namely to me. And there is no time to waste. Crammed into the reporter's imported SUV, we speed off into the mountains en route to the site where He began his career as a YTC miner. On the subsiding ground of an old but now abandoned station of Ma Mine, He assumes the role of director and actor of a television program on tin culture. Before the rolling camera, He reenacts the political life course of the Sha Ding as he transmits its effective lessons through my body. Like the cultural works of the last 50 years, He uses lived experience to validate the truth claims of official history, but he also uses the same lived experience to validate the deviations of official history, to validate the deviations from that official history in his own biography. The camera zooms in on my movements and on my facial expressions as He narrates the emancipation of the downtrodden tin miner under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party. Following the lead of my political instructor, I walk the stone path on which a sedan chair transported the tin boss to the mines. I touch the exposed soil in which the Sha Ding toiled in the maze of tunnels below my feet. I taste the wild greens that the Sha Ding ate. I investigate the rubble of the old blockhouse of capitalist brutality, pointing to the remains of the YTC infirmary, canteen, and offices that he frequented. He concludes by contrasting the bitterness of life before 1949 to the sweetness of life after 1949 as he lived it. This exercise in documentary realism both perpetuates the party's vision of socialist modernity and reevaluates the terms of national membership and historical authorship. On the stage of Ma Mine, He dramatically exploited the evidentiary powers of materiality and memory. Taking advantage of the technology of the camera, he displayed and promoted all of his special characteristics, the source of his expertise. Set in our roles as teacher and student, as marketer and consumer, I helped affirm his authority and value. I confirmed the lure of historical speculation, and I confirmed the selling power of his version of tin culture. It is a highly persuasive means to raise one's value in a highly competitive market of manufactured cultural products. On the journey home down the mountain, the female reporter who is driving the SUV comes to a screeching halt at the old entrance to Ma Mine. Before us, miners coated in red ore emerge from the earth. Uneducated, impoverished, rural youth who are part-time miners paid by the load. She screams, "Shakti!" With his eyes full of rage, He points a finger of accusation at the scene before us, reenacting the emotive and gestural choreography of revolutionary agency. He is pitched to indict a political enemy. At the top of his lungs, he screams, "They say exploitation no longer exists, but it still exists." They, party officials, they say exploitation no longer exists, but here is empirical evidence to the contrary. He challenges the legitimacy of party rule in its own terms and through its own conventions. Thank you.
Must have a lot of questions.
That was a very beautiful talk, and just full of stuff. And I have a couple of questions. I'm still trying to put them together, though. So, you know, it's a very specific pedagogical practice, and you've talked about its specificities, and it's clear that, you know, I mean, there's this theory of perceptual learning. You know, you made that very clear. What seems so specific about it is that everything is to scale. I was struck by the you know, clay statues of the people, and there were dozens of them, right? Which were all they're not bigger and they're not smaller, perhaps.
They are.
They're bigger.
Not good. I mean, they're
smaller.
They're life size.
They're life size.
But
they're like, sorry.
No, they're life size, but you know, so children and dogs are in life size.
Children and dogs are children, and dogs are dogs, and then there's a
Exactly.
children's, the kids' actual bones, and then the actual stuff. Everything is to scale, and I just wanted you to give you a chance to reflect on that a little bit, because the thing that and you know, the journey through the mine, where you get down on your knees and you crawl, and you know, there's all this embodiment. You know, there's so many other ways that this could be done, and many other, I mean, as you know, many other possibilities that they had to choose from. So, and I know that you're making that point. It's just that there seems to be more there. It's so over kind of produced, this scale, this life-size scale kind of thing. And I just wanted you to reflect on that a little bit. And then the second question, sorry to give you two at once, but the local is very important in your talk. And it strikes me that, you know, it's not just that, well, the local is there, it's local, we all know that, but it's probable that the local's also being produced in specific ways through these practices. So I just wanted to also give you a chance to reflect on that.
So scale is important. sure how to tackle the question by saying that this particular instance of propaganda relates to a broader practice that Lin Biao developed in 1960 that then surfaced in the socialist education movement, and it requires a sort of imposition onto all of this of yet another layer of discourse, which I chose not to do for this talk, being able to draw out how this was actually reconfigured through a particular locality, which is what matters to me, because these narratives have become central to the ways in which my confidence in Gejiu understand the past. So the broader level of discourse is called living ideological education, which was developed in 1960, and the emphasis is on the body and is on living and is in providing individuals with an experience of both at the level of perception as well as at the level of embodiment of something called living history. So it's important that one is engaging with these things in scale. And I think the scale also then reinforces the truth claims that are endeavoring to be made and adopted by the visitors. So yes, the local is very important. However, one of the complications in my research, and which I run into in audiences, is an effort to try to have me explain what the local really is. And of course, the local can never be represented. It is a representation itself. But the local as I know it, and the local history as I know it, and the history that my confidants talk about is this local that has been created over the course of party rule through these acts of narration and re-narration. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is in tracing out, they're important to my confidence, so I do it myself, and sort of tracing out the ways in which local history has been written and rewritten over the course of party rule as a way of breaking down the binary that presently exists in the study of contemporary Chinese history, namely the binary between a Mao era and a reform era. And rather, I'm interested in thinking about shifting configurations of history over the scope of the Chinese past, and hence what kinds of work must go into the binding off of time into these very homogeneous periods, such as the Mao period versus the reform era, and what sort of work that does. And of course, that practice itself is at the center of the practice of Jinshi, right? And that practice is taken up in our own replication of communist ideology, as well as the way in which that ideology is read through Cold War ideology. So that's sort of where I'm going with all this, but sort of this work of sort of looking through this series of propaganda created in the 1950s, 1960s, as well as the writing of local gazetteers in the reform era, allows me to trace out in a very detailed way these kinds of narrative and ideological shifts which show us how important Chinese Marxist theory is to the representation and experience of history as it was lived under socialism, both in the past and in the present. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess a little bit following up on that, I'm glad you mentioned the idea of living, what do you call it, living ideology?
Living ideological education.
Yeah, because one of the questions I had was about the temporal nature, like why did this exhibition appear in the early 1970s? So to understand more about the trajectory of how educational practices changed. And I find it really interesting the way in which these exhibitions actually, to me, represent a sort of really sophisticated approach to museum practice. So it reminds me of something you see at the African American History Museum at the
Right.
when you go through the slave ship. And so I think that if you place this in the context of museum design, I feel like there's been efforts to recuperate aspects of Maoist propaganda culture, like Suzanne Pepper's book on education and radical experiments in education that were actually quite innovative and quite experimental in a way that would be appreciated even by education experimenters today. So I'm really curious how you think museum designers in other parts of the world, in other contexts, would look at this museum as a type of experimental or progressive approach to museum design outside of the context of, specifically Maoist ideology. And then secondly, how this type of a museum design was a product of the specific Cultural Revolution era.
There are a lot of questions there, and I think one question was about time, right? And one was about design, and I'm not sure I remember the last one.
Yeah, so I guess I'm really interested in how would this museum fit into like a broader notion of museum practices,
So,
and then the historical moment of the Cultural Revolution producing this specific exhibition.
So one of the complications of, as you know, doing research about the Mao era is that it's a relatively young field. And so there's a lot that we don't yet know about. So I know that some of these representational technologies come from the Soviet Union, but there isn't much scholarship at this point. I mean, we need somebody that knows Russian, Chinese, and English to sort of bring some of these things to view. So I'm aware that, for instance, Soviet museumology, if that's the pronunciation is correct, works are being translated in the 1950s, and this is specifically in relationship to the creation of the national museums in Beijing, which are built, as you know, during the Great Leap Forward, but the planning stage begins in the early 1950s because the party puts a lot of energy and interest into needing to create a national museum to represent the past. So one of the things that happens are that delegations from the PRC are sent to the Soviet Union to tour museums in the Soviet Union, and then that also results in a whole wave of translation of practices of design. It's just that there hasn't been that much research on that, and sort of that's not really the focus of my work because I'm sort of using this as a means to understand the kinds of cultural resources and narratives that my confidants use to narrate past as well as to narrate their lives. So there is a long history of this, and I didn't have time either to show it, but it actually goes back to, and this would be a project in and of itself for a student that would be interested in looking at these things as they were developed in Yunnan, because in that period and also in the 1940s, these kinds of exhibitions were being put up as one form of cultural work, aside from just the dances and the songs and the operas that we know about. These sort of makeshift traveling exhibition halls were being erected in localities to do things like teach the significance of land reform in particular by explicating a contrast between what life was like in the old society and what the party had brought into being through the redistribution of land. So there's a history there, and that history has yet to really been traced out. I know that in my locality, these sorts of things were being set up in the early 1950s to celebrate the achievements of the first 5-year plan. They're part of the Great Leap Forward's effort. They again appear in the socialist education movement, Cultural Revolution. They're ongoing. You actually see them. One of the exhibitions I want to write about itself is the Communist Party's large, the road to rejuvenation, the massive propagandistic exhibition that's now located in the National Museum of China, right, which is using all of these representational technologies. This has an entire history. So I think, to sort of briefly answer the other question, I'm sure that, you know, if this is an interest in museum studies, and there is this movement now towards thinking about the senses as a way in which museums could be more interactive, certainly this might be appealing to these sort of these new efforts, but sort of that is not really where I'm going with this. Yeah. Joseph.
A very simple question. I'm very struck by your reference to the idea of performance, and then there's some suku or yiku things done on the spot.
Right.
Do you have any video, audio recordings of such?
I don't. I wish I did. I mean, there are textual encapsulations of the experience. For instance, when, you know, because international dialogue took place during the Mao era between the Communist Party and other socialist nations, right? So there were tour groups that came to the PRC at particular moments, especially in the context of the socialist education movement. So there are accounts of Westerners, such as Swedish visitors and German visitors, who are put in a room and experience this thing called yiku, and are incredibly moved by the experience because it's so powerful. Of course, what's really fascinating too in these depictions is that, like, the party, they're also really confused because, like, they're so taken up by this man or woman's story that the party cadre next to them is, you know, like spinning a pen in his finger, or looks entirely, you know, non-pulsed by what's going on. But as far as I know, there's no audio recordings of it, and many of the individuals that did this over the course of the Mao era were deceased by the time I arrived in Gejiu, because I did ask to see if I could meet some of these old miners, because they become specialists in their own ways. They're asked to do this over and over, and you know, have a sort of a mini career as an actor, shall we say, but they don't think of it that way, and that's sort of my point, is that it's not perceived as acting. It's perceived as an explication of truth and life as it was lived.
Other questions? Yeah.
That was quite a dramatic ending you gave. That was really good. I was wondering, is there any after story about He and his exclamation about there's current exploitation? What did he?
Well, he's a slippery character. I mean, he's a child of the Cultural Revolution, a former Red Guard as well, and so he has a very fascinating and complicated relationship to the party, himself being a party member. So, you know, when something upsets him, he has no problem speaking his mind. Yet at the same time, he's highly involved in the deliberations that are going on and wants involvement in them, and is upset that he's not involved. But in the end, he does get cut out from this sort of work of creating tin culture at the local level. So what he ends up doing is going to so Gejiu is a city, but it's also a prefectural capital. And it's the prefectural capital of a prefecture called the Honghe Han minority and Yi nationality minority autonomous prefecture. So both the city government and the prefectural government, I know it's a lot of administrative stuff, are located in Gejiu. So what he does is he says, forget you city officials, I'm going to go market my talents to the prefectural government officials. And the prefectural government officials are more interested in what he has to have to offer, because the prefecture itself a minority nationality prefecture, which would allow this kind of representation of a non-Han history. Whereas Gejiu itself, although, let's say 80% Han Chinese, is very, historically has been very insistent on representing this locality as an emblem of socialist modernity, because it is an incredibly important site of heavy industry in the People's Republic of China. But He wants to challenge that. He wants to challenge that in a variety of ways, which again doesn't mean he's not going to help out when it's not to his benefit, but he doesn't start a protest if that's what you were looking for. There's no worker organization going on here. He's too interested in making a buck himself, so it's not a possibility. Yeah.
How do you react as an American anthropologist to being hijacked by this person made you into his puppet of his propaganda film?
Well, I think field work is a very particular kind of research experience. So you have an enormous amount of debt you owe to your confidant. And your confidants, you have different kinds of relationships to different individuals. I wouldn't call He Chunming a friend of mine. He likes to use the term that's commonly used among party officials as 朋友, you 帮我的忙, 我帮你的忙 sort of thing, I help you, you help me sort of thing. So from my perspective, he's done a lot for me. He goes out of his way to assist me. And I feel like I have a debt to repay. I was uncomfortable with it, but what am I going to do?
Well, so maybe on that note we can close this. By the way, I have to say this, this is very timely because next March, the Confucius Institute has worked with UMA to produce a big Chinese painting exhibition, and one of the highlights of it is paintings of miners. So we can maybe come back and talk about these things. So thank you for coming, and thank you for Lara for